All right, welcome back. It's good to be the first one after lunch rather than the one before, I guess. So, anyway, my name is John Kirklis. I was here last year, and I covered some of this talk. I discussed about our DITA pipeline and our CI/CD environment, and then I just started to touch on Markdown, the challenges that we were having. And so this time I'm going to go into a bit more depth about just that topic. And I am the tools architect for the user assistance group in the cloud and network services part of Nokia. And this was going to be my alternate slide title right here, but at the beginning, Jarno talked about fitting a square peg into a round hole with trying to get DITA and Markdown to work together. But since then, the gap's been getting closed, and I, for one, appreciate all those efforts. Anyways, my background, 13 years of it, is in dealing with DITA and technical writing. And the last 5 have been with Nokia. And I'm going to go through this. You'll see the agenda. You can reverse engineer it after I'm done, so I don't take any more time with that. So I want to make a distinction between documentation that is for end customers versus internal customers. And the people who develop the software for our customers are product R&D, right? They write the software that does the domain-specific things that Nokia does for a business. And then we have the people who write the documentation for the products are professional technical writers. And they're dealing, for the most part, the great majority, in DITA. And then for the internal customers, there are developers who work on framework components that the product R&D people can incorporate into their product, add their product-specific software to, and produce something shippable, deliverable. And the people who develop that software are the framework component R&D people, but they also write most of the software. So you've got framework R&D developers writing documentation for their peers who are in the product R&D groups who are developers. So you've got a developer to developer communication path going on there. And that used to be done in Confluence for many, many years. And that started to present problems. Some of you know Confluence from Atlassian is a wiki, but it's kind of a closed system. It's the good part of that. It's a closed system. It does basically what you need to do to author something easily through a web browser and to have it accessible and query and all that. However, it is kind of a closed garden, other than doing stuff with APIs. But it's really difficult to do basically docs as code when it's locked in Confluence. And so all the software is being version controlled and stored and all of that inside Git repositories. So it would be great if the framework component documentation was also co-located somewhat in the same kind of repos as the source code that the developers are writing, rather than shoved off to Confluence. So over a period of 6 months, team worked to this isn't anything to do with me, this is another team in Ottawa that focused on basically getting everything out of Confluence and getting it into, and Markdown was chosen. And they wanted to make things easier to reproduce. They also refactored the content at the same time, because you had these huge, long Confluence pages. And they chose at that point to make it topic-based. And then they could leverage it downstream. It was more suitable in a CI/CD environment, that when you updated your code, you would also could update and package the documentation that went with that code. You wouldn't have to, as a documentation team, do something, throw it over the wall, and then it gets kind of integrated manually by the product teams. And these framework components fall into a bunch of different categories. I'm listing some of them there. These are things that all the product R&D developers would probably want to use, given the kind of business that Nokia is in, controlling big telecommunications networks. And so you'll have application runtimes, you'll have container management, a number of different databases, handling faults, alarms, all that stuff, performance monitoring, protocols, operating system security, just real basic stuff. Because for a while, every product R&D group would go off and grab something and roll their own. The next one would do the same. The next one would do the same. And now you're repeating something, 50, 60 times and being done differently every single time. So now we have this common framework that these R&D groups could use. And they were security hardened, they were reviewed, they were tested on all of the various environments that we might deploy products into, a lot of different Kubernetes environments and so on. And then this is kind of a snapshot. It's probably not 100% correct since I just asked for it yesterday. But you'll see that for this framework component, there's over 5,000 Markdown files. There's about 286 DITA ones, and that's because there are things that DITA can do that Markdown can't. Conditionalization for one of them, and several other things. So there may be things that, as you'll see, we'll control in a DITA map, but it's actually referencing a combination of DITA and Markdown together. And you can kind of see the average size, about 154 lines of content, and the median is 75. So they did bring that size down quite a bit. Now, on the other side of the fence, so we had the DITA ecosystem was being developed in the group that I'm in, and we had a set of tools that we had been using for a while at Nokia, of course, Oxygen XML, and we were doing content validation with Schematron, and also we've experimented and tested with using Veil, which works with Oxygen's terminology checker, as well as their XML way of stating things more simply than Schematron. And we only had one flavor to worry about, because it was an OASIS standard, and we could publish to HTML and PDF, and we wrote our own custom plugins for our branding and so forth. And then our pipeline, like I showed last year, basically runs in Jenkins. We have a whole suite of unit tests that run. And we also run the same Schematron rules that we run inside of Oxygen. We actually run it as well in our CI/CD platform. So every push that's done kicks off a job, and one of the phases is to run the Schematron rules, and then it takes the results of the Schematron validation, converts it to JUnit formats, which Jenkins knows how to ingest, and then it integrates nicely into the Jenkins UI. And then from there, it gets pushed to a number of internal sites. So that's the kind of the DITA pipeline. And this is kind of on the front end. In the back end, basically just shows what I just stated. And now we're going to talk about the Markdown ecosystem. So the first thing they had to do is they had to choose a flavor of Markdown. When they went to convert it from Confluence to Markdown, it's like, what flavor of the month of Markdown are you going to pick? And so for internal publishing of internal documentation, they just wanted to host it on a website that the product R&D people could go to. And for that, they chose an open source package called MKDocs. It's a static, site generator and hosting environment, and it's Python based, and it looks like a lot of other, web help tools that you'll see with some selections of content on the left, and on the right, maybe a mini TOC of what's in the particular document, and then your content in the middle, and a title bar with some options at the top. And then for authoring tools, they very quickly went to VS Code, Microsoft VS Code, for writing in Markdown. And so what they wound up doing is creating a profile for VS Code, right? There's a bunch of extensions. There's thousands of extensions for VS Code. And so Michael, who's on our team, who did all this, he packaged up a bunch of the extensions that an R&D developer is likely to use when they're writing Markdown content, and bundling it, all together so that on the left here in this pane, which doesn't look like it's showing when I move it here at least, but anyway, the left content pane is the Markdown, and then on the right is the preview, the HTML preview that you're seeing there, and it updates in real time. And by the way, the same thing, you can do this in Oxygen as well, but they wanted to stay open source for what they were doing. It was changing too quickly, so that's what they do. But a lot of times, since I'm in Oxygen anyway, I'll just open up the same content inside of Oxygen. It works fine. And again, these are just a list of, in case it was too small before, of the different kind of extensions that they have going on. So they got code spell checker going on in there, a bunch of Docker plugins, Git plugins, visualizing, let's say, diagrams using Mermaid or Plant UML, and then different syntax highlighters for like Kubernetes, Helm charts, and other things like that. And so the validation environment, okay, what they're doing is they went with Veil, okay? You couldn't use Schematron, it's not XML. So there's an open source project called Veil, and like a lot of other validation tools, you'll have different levels of warnings, different severities, and so on. And you basically would configure it using a YAML file, where you would say, this is a substitution kind of rule, messages, it's a replace action. You could narrow the scope to say only apply this to like a table or a header or something if you wanted to. And then there's going to be different actions and directives here. So this basically would look at the file extension in a code block, and then it would basically change the name that's shown beside it from and use the full name. And then there is the preview there on the right. Okay, then so the publishing is done by MKDocs. Content reviews are done using GitLab merge requests, which are like pull requests in GitHub. And so anytime something was pushed to the Git server, it would kick off the validation and then generate the HTML in the last phase. And some of the things they would do to validate is that since you can embed HTML inside of Markdown, right, you can write some pretty roguish HTML, which by the time it hit other parts of the pipeline would basically kill it. And then, so it would test for all kinds of common things that people try to get away with HTML inside of Markdown. I mean, Markdown was created by a blogger who didn't want to edit and write in HTML with HTML tags. So basically created a text-based equivalent as best he could, and it would generate HTML for him. And then there's link checkers. And then for a pre-flight or a smoke test, it would take all of the existing Markdown that the R&D developer had written, and it would use the Markdown Gitbook transform. And that would, since it runs very quickly, it was a real easy way to get a sanity check. If that failed, then there's no need to go to the next step, which is to kick off our Dockerized DITA OT-based platform to publish to PDF. And so if this fails here, you want it to fail early, and that's what it would do. And if not, it would go to the next step. And for those of you who, I'm not going to expect everyone to read this code, so I'm just going to zoom in on a few things and explain them. So here you see it's invoking DITA with that DITA command line we love so much, and saying that we want the Markdown Git book output, and we want to enable strict processing mode, which means fail. Okay, fail if there's any kind of an error, and then tee out the log besides the console to a file. And then if the DITA command just fails outright, it gets captured. And then, but if it succeeds, then it's going to go looking for the word error anywhere in the OT log. And if it does, okay, then it's going to capture the string of all of those together, and it's going to just put it out to a file, and it's going to give them, whatever errors they want to see. And this looks like an additional check for some special case of using superscripts or something. But this basically determines on what the, there's no real good validators like there is for DITA, but for Markdown. So you've got to resort to all kinds of levels of checking with that. And so this is kind of how the two environments break down. So you've got, for Markdown, of course, the source are MD files, the editor's VS Code. QA is done by this collection of validation tools I mentioned. It can either be, we have a couple different types of Git servers. Garrett, which is from Google, they use internally and open sourced it, and then GitLab. And DITA, we use Oxygen as the editor, and we have a bunch of plugins and schematron rules that we use for validation. And the rest of this stuff, basically you can read, but it's important to note that the whole Markdown pipeline of this is all running in GitLab CI environment, while the DITA builds are happening in our Jenkins pipeline. But we can do them in either one. Git is Git, and so it really doesn't matter. And we've got a lot of repos in Garrett that have submodules pointing to things in GitLab, and then vice versa. So there's a lot of, for reuse, there's a lot of connections going back and forth between these two different worlds. So if you don't need any kind of interoperability between DITA or Markdown, you may not have any problems. You'll have your own individual problems in each area. But if you don't care about leveraging one and the other, you don't have to worry about a different suite of problems. But if you want modern HTML5, or you want nicely branded, PDFs that aren't just some automatic conversion that someone's done on the HTML, but something that's been, point by point, positioned exactly where it needs to be with headers and footers and list of tables and figures and all of that. Now you're starting to stretch what a lot of these Markdown environments can do. And again, if you want any kind of conditionalization, you're not going to get that with Markdown, unless you hack your Markdown pipeline. So a lot of companies, I know, because I've looked at the source code, like Microsoft's Learn environment, right? They added new syntax to Markdown. And I think it's like if you put 2 colons and then some directive, it would, when it sees it, it either enables some special processing or goes off and does something different before it comes back. Now, if you want, and also if you want to enable the same kind of validation rule, so if you've got R&D developers, right, who don't have as much background in writing, you want to give them as much help as they can. So the cleaner that their content is, right, the cleaner the end result is going to be. Because if you've got DITA technical writers who are looking at this Markdown and they're saying, okay, this isn't clear, or I'm spending all my time fixing typos and other kinds of errors, that's just a waste of time. So as much as possible, we've been going to using the same set of validation rules and terminology, like restricted trademarks and all that, between these two different systems. Now this thing, I need to have a drink first. And I had to make this very generic so I wouldn't have the names of particular pieces of internal software. But this on the left here, let's say, would be your product. Oh, I have to go over here like this. It's not reflecting it. There it is. Okay. And so we'll have a repo. We'll just call the product or prod. And there'll be this isn't comprehensive, but there'll be a directory in which all the content shows up. And so there'll be DITA map files located in here. Could be one for every chapter, perhaps. And then a bunch of DITA-based directories that have content for each chapter, let's say. There could be a reuse directory, which has reusable DITA pieces that can be conrefed from other DITA topics and so forth. And then we have, this is just a convention we came up with. I don't know if I do it the same way again, but a directory or a placeholder called remotes. And so, one Git repo can basically point to parts of other Git repos. Okay, and that's one kind of poor man's way to achieve some kind of reuse at the directory level, let's say. And also, we'll have whatever files we need to build run our DITA pipeline. So since it's Maven and Ant based still right now, it uses a POM and a build.xml. So that's basically what you need to do the product documentation. However, what wound up happening is now product documentation can now point to these Markdown repos. Okay, so if there are certain kinds of documentation that are that the tech writer doesn't have to mess with a whole lot. Let's say it's something detailed, like maybe it's installation instructions, right? It's just a step-by-step. You don't need to be very good with the English language or be able to write a novel to be able to put together installation instructions. And so some of these things could be used as is, as long as someone who is a tech writer takes a look at it and they have final say-so. And so let's say here's component one over here. Where's my cursor? Come over here. Here we go. I saw you there. So this is in its own repo. It's being pointed to from this product repo that has the DITA content. And it'll have the files it needs to go ahead and build an MK docs, a doc set. And then here's the GitLab CI instructions to go do the build and run the validation and so on. And so this structure that you see from here out and blown all the way to the right, that's going to repeat itself for every single one of these components. And so the docs directory will have the Markdown content. So you'll have a whole bunch of Markdown directories, and then you'll have your index, which is like the map, and then you'll have another directory here, which is actually a submodule pointing to yet another repo, which is the Kudo customer documentation. So if there's any customer documentation that's been written for this component, it's going to be sitting over here. And that, of course, is sitting over in this other repo. And then it has its own structure, which could consist of both Markdown content and DITA content, okay, including things like DITA vals for conditionalization, any DITA variables you want to have, any reusable DITA, and any, let's say, like you have steps in the procedure that is very common, and you want to be able just to refer to that with the conref, then you can include that down here. So now some of these are in this Git repo server that, and then some are over in GitLab. So we'll have situations, like I said, where we've got these virtual directories, because that's what they look like, reaching back and forth across the aisle between the DITA world and the Markdown world, but either one can actually exist in either repo. And so we've got some kind of interesting challenges there. Along the way, Yarno came out with, I don't know if it was at my prodding, because I would always ask Yarno, hey, could you support attribute lists? Could you support this in Markdown? But since there's so many Markdown flavors, he would get into it and then realize, oh boy, this is only supported this way using the Python version of Markdown that mkdoc supports. What am I gonna do now? Every time I gotta do it for everyone if I say we support attribute lists? No, we just support it, when you're paired with this over here. And so, or it just could have been, like he said earlier, there's a way of declaring schemas, like JSON schemas and others. And he created a system that you could, if you had the Java skills on your team, you could basically intercept part of the normal default Markdown to DITA conversion that happens transparently behind the scenes. There's no writers taking the Markdown and saying convert to DITA. This is all happening behind the scenes. We knew this was going to be useful. We could see other things we wanted to be able to do with Markdown and DITA down the road. So we wanted to create a POC, a proof of concept project, because we had created a new DITA metadata element called the use case. Okay, DITA has a bunch of built-in ones that you're familiar with, and then we wanted something that was called use case that we were going to use in our documentation client and browsing application. So we specialized our DITA schemas. We created a use case element, but what are you going to do in Markdown? So it looked like it was a narrow enough change that we could try to make and basically understand all the pieces, the basic infrastructure that has to be in place. However, on the left here are a bunch of, remember Markdown, there's kind of a informal standard called Common Mark, and then there's GitHub flavored Markdown, and then there's other things. But in this Python Markdown thing, there was kind of your core, and then there were these extensions that you could implement to do different things like handle abbreviations and attribute lists, definition lists, footnotes, code blocks, etc., tables, and all these things. So the library that Yarno uses in the Lightweight DITA project that is a Java library that can handle a number of different Markdown flavors. In fact, it's written to be able to basically assemble your own Markdown parser. And by making a list of all of the extensions, Markdown extensions, you want to be able to support in your own flavor of Markdown. And then you can get into real detail, because even if it handles tables, there may be something like, well, how do you handle column spans? Do you support column spans or not? Some flavor of Markdown may support it, some may not. Really? Okay, thank you. So, cut to the chase. So, by default, if you use a non-standard YAML header, it's going to get converted into a data element that has a name and value pair. And we wanted it to basically create a use case element over in DITA. And so I had to basically simulate this because I like the way Oxygen shows these, but if we generated use case, it would break the DITA validation, because it says, I don't know about this at all. And maybe someday, Oxygen can tie into our schema based Markdown validator and maybe do something with that. But that's fine for now. I just wanted to give you an idea of what that wound up doing. And then it propagated its way. Once you have this, into HTML5, and it would show up as the use case metadata, and then our content browser, which takes all this in, ingests it all, can now create hierarchical facets and all kinds of things. Now it's made its way all the way through into HTML5. We had some challenges, no problem, we got through it, but there could be issues where the Markdown environment has added extensions that we haven't in the DITA environment. And one of them are UML diagrams, which basically you can generate diagrams from text. You don't have to go into graphics editor, you just learn this kind of syntax. Here's an example of a sequence diagram, and it automatically will draw and render thing in SVG or PNG or whatever you like on the fly. So that works fine when you're looking at it in MKDocs, because he's built this into his Docker container. We haven't done that yet for DITA OT, but there is a plugin that, and here's another example, let's say of a mind map, etc. But this is something that Radu, you had a blog post about this, I believe. So this is a DITA OT plugin. You use a DITA foreign element, and you use a certain output class, and it will get substituted in with whatever the generated graphic is on the fly. So when you have something that's an extension to Markdown that a lot of people use, if you want to be able to use that same content in DITA, then you're going to have to find a way to do that. And you might have to change the name, because we have to generate a DITA foreign element to make it work with Radu's plugin. So those are just some of the challenges, but they can be overcome. And the rest of it, I was going to go into specific code details that I don't need to go into it at all. So are there any questions that anyone has? No time for questions?
We have none.
Okay. I mean, that's been the pattern I picked up.
Any questions? I think in your last year's 2022 presentation, you talk about how you link between the modules. Like if you have your Markdown module connected up, is that true? Is it in last year's presentation? Because I wasn't here for that. Like, if you, do your writers have difficulty if they have to link between the DITA and the Markdown with up and over links and things like that? Do you have a standard way of linking between your modules?
Oh, I've seen it. I've seen it in the test content. I haven't done it myself, but I've seen.
Just getting used to it.
Yeah. No, it's definitely an issue. There's a whole help section that's devoted to doing this, but I don't have that answer off the top of my head, unfortunately. Yeah, Roger, was that your hand or? Oh, okay. And that's the thing. Most of our test content so far has been, DITA. But now we need to include it, our own DITA developers who write and work on the OT plugins and then customizing Oxygen. We know DITA. Those developers know DITA. So they have to get up to speed, just like Roger, when you were doing the documentation for Markdown, you had to get up to speed too.
Yeah, I can just say how we do that in the DITA OT docs is that we just use keys for that. So if there's a link in a Markdown topic that points to an XML topic, it's just pointing to a key. It has no idea whether that topic is XML or Markdown, and the other way around. So just put a key on it, and it seems to work.
Elliot is the key master. He'll tell you all about it. Thank you.